listening to Resist and Restore, a podcast from the Circle of Hope Pastors, where we're extending the table of our dialogue. I'm Jonny Rashid. I use he, him pronouns.
I'm Rachel Sensenig. I use she, her pronouns.
And I'm Julie Hoke. I use she, her pronouns too.
Welcome to our show. I'm so glad that you're here and part of our listening body. We want you to feel like you're a part of our community. We really do want to extend the table of our dialogue, and this episode is another opportunity for that. Later on in the episode, I'm going to talk to some friends of mine who have read Andre Henry's All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, and it is a book that touched many of us in Circle of Hope as we are on our own anti-racist, anti-oppression journey. So in this interview, we're going to reflect on how this book related to our leaders' experiences in Circle. So I hope that nourishes you. We're going to start with some talk back and end with spiritual show and tell. And Rachel's going to lead us in talk back.
Thanks, Jonny. Yes, I'm hearing a lot of talk back about the parable of Jesus that we were looking at this Sunday in our meeting. We're doing the parables of Jesus this season, and I think it's really applicable for the movement of our whole church and really of Jesus followers around the world. Zach Agoff gave the message, and he gave an interpretation that caused many of us to realize that we had previously heard this really individualistic interpretation of Jesus's parable of the sower, like that immediately caused us, like in our growing up years or whenever we heard it before in the evangelical church, to like assess ourselves worriedly, like, are we good soil or not? Are we like, is there rocks in our soil? Like, are we choking out the word with like the worries of life, the thorns, the cares of wealth, and not like those aren't good questions, but Zach kind of expanded our view and gave this picture of the good soil actually being powerful enough by the power of Jesus and the Spirit to break down the rocks and the thorns, to actually transform the soil into something that could produce fruit for the whole world. He talked about it being part of this Jesus's movement of redemption, this redemption project for the whole world. And then Marcel was talking about it last night and added another layer. And this was mostly from Per Folland, who said, Jesus is really telling us not to give up here, because the sower keeps sowing the seed, even though some of it doesn't take root. But it seems like Jesus's point is keep sowing, because the stuff that does fall in good soil is going to multiply, 30, 60, 100 times, because people who understand the good soil is people who understand that it's meant to be shared. Again, it's this communal movement. So I'm wondering, Pastor, is that different for you too from what you heard before? Like, how does that compare to your understanding of the parable of the sower, or not?
Totally. That's a different angle, I guess, or interpretation than I have heard growing up. I even remember a childhood book about that parable. Anyway, I was picturing the images in that book as you were talking. And I'm just appreciating in this talk back here that it is in community that revelation and like an expansive understanding is revealed. And that's kind of the Per's point, I think, but it's also the point of this whole segment of like, what are we hearing in our body? What are people talking back to? Because often the wisdom and insight and inspiration that come through our community is kind of the gold. It's where the revelation is happening.
Yes.
It's a parable about parables, which is my favorite thing about it. Like Jesus is literally talking about, like, I am sowing seeds. These stories are seeds. If you have ears to hear them, you're good soil to receive them, right? I wonder if Jesus, like Paris saying, keep going, keep sowing. I wonder if Jesus also needs the encouragement to, like, keep sowing seeds, keep telling the story. You'll find people that'll receive it. And it would be interesting if we approached how we share the good news with the same kind of generosity, as opposed to evaluating how well it's received. And evangelical circles, like how big the meeting is, how many people came, who didn't, that kind of thing. And we just think about, let's just be faithful sowers, and not get so caught up on the not keep checking all the plants to see if they're growing, and kind of evaluating ourselves based on that, But then also, like, I like what Per was saying. I like the keep sowing seeds, and do our best to create a world where they can be received well. But I don't know how much Jesus, the sower, was evaluating how effective they were based on what the seeds were doing.
Yes. I was really encouraged by that. I think it struck me as particularly encouraging in this moment when I think the stat is like a third of pastors have quit in the United States in the past 2 years. And, we see, like, in terms of like the institutional church in the United States, I've heard the term now, it's not just the nuns, like, that researchers are tracking, the people who are not part of an institutional church. Now it's the duns, like people who have tried it and they left. And there's a lot of those folks, and I think it can be really discouraging. So I really personally heard Jesus saying, like, don't give up. Don't give up. This is just how it is. But the seed that takes root will multiply, because this is a communal movement. This is something to be shared.
Thanks so much for listening to our podcast. We're so happy that you're part of our community. We want to keep connecting with you. We were giving you talk back from what happened in our Sunday meetings. If you want to get connected to one of our Sunday meetings, you can go to circleofhope.church to do that. But we also want talk back on what we're offering in this podcast. So write to us at Resist and Restore Podcast at circleofhope.net and listen to today's episode with Andre or with the people who read All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep, and then last week with Dante Stewart, and Will O'Brien was on our show recently, and Christy and Angela, and this whole season is full of dynamic people that we definitely want your responses to. So if you listen, you can even just write us and say you liked it, and you can review us that way too. Wherever you listen, just give us a high rating and tell us what you liked about the podcast, and then share it with people that you think would like to receive it. To use the parable we were just quoting, sow the seed and look for the people who are going to receive it. Those who have ears to receive what we're offering, we're looking for them. And if this isn't someone's thing, you don't got to convince them to listen. Just find the people that want to do it. Thanks again for listening. Hey all, I'm excited to have Rebekah McLendon and Corinne Bergmann. They're two leaders in Circle of Hope on our show. They recently read Andre Henry's book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. And after I read the book, I realized that so much of it was applicable to Circle of Hope, the church that we're part of, and some of the work that we've done over the last 2 or 3 years, and even more than that. So I want to get their thoughts on how it relates to our church, and hopefully that can help create a bigger conversation about issues around race and whiteness specifically. So welcome to the show, Rebekah and Corinne.
Thanks so much. Good to be here.
Thanks.
So I want to ask you, this is a broad question, and we're going to get into a lot of stuff today, but I want to start by just saying, how did the book impact you? Can you think of one way you felt impacted when you read Andre's book?
Sure, I can start. So I'm Corinne, use she, her pronouns. Yeah, I related to this book, well, for one thing, in a really personal way, because I have a personal connection with Andre. So I went to Fuller Seminary as he did and lived in Pasadena as he did, like around the same time frame. I believe he started at Fuller like around the same time I graduated. So we had a lot of mutual friends. Like, I don't know him personally, but we have a lot of mutual friends. And so reading this book, like the places and the theology and the culture and the events, like J.R. Thomas's murder by the Pasadena police and the subversive liturgy during Advent that fall, and all these different events and places he talks about were personal to me, like that I had friends that were part of those things and knew about them as they were happening. Participated a smidge, but not a ton. But so I think for me, hearing his interpretation of the events as juxtaposed to how I experienced them was like really illuminating, because as a white person, like they didn't hit me at the same core level. Like I was aware they were happening and tangentially involved, but not as personally involved as he was. So even just kind of looking at that for myself, like what was I doing when those things were happening and I knew about them? And so that was one way that I related to it. But also, as you said, Jonny, that it was also a really helpful lens to go and look at the stuff that we've been through as a church in recent years. And also like a lot of the analysis that he does particularly about predominantly white institutions that he's been part of, the similarities were so uncanny to like things that we've been through, that it was totally. Like, oh, there are patterns here. This isn't like, yeah, it was helpful to seeing our own church through that lens more clearly.
How about you, Rebekah? Thanks, Corinne, for that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I'm Rebekah. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a white woman, which I feel like is also related to this book. Yeah, I really love this book. I also grew up in an evangelical Christian church, like Andre Henry, which was so interesting getting into it. And one of the things that I had first connected with when I was reading it was he talked about this boys group that he was part of called the Royal Rangers, which I was actually part of the girls' counterpart called Missionettes. And my dad actually taught the Royal Rangers, for example. My brothers were in the Royal Rangers. So it was immediately like kind of drew me in just on that personal connection. And also we talked a lot in the church I grew up in about Revelations and like apocalyptic topics and Left Behind and things like that. So I love that like throughout the entire book he talked about that sense of being left behind, but like in a totally different spin, and using it in terms of feeling left behind by white folks, and then how he puts it with all the white folks that he left, feels as though he has to leave behind. So yeah.
Thanks, Rebekah. There's a quote in the book that says the sad truth about white people is that most of them are too attached to the notion of racial superiority to cheer, much less fight for racial progress. How has this been true in our church? Let's just get into it. How has it been true that white people are too attached to their own superiority to cheer or not, much less fight for racial progress?
Do you want to jump in? I'm like,
yeah.
Who goes first?
This is, I mean, for me, I think in fact, it's, there's like a sad and even destructive truth to this. Unfortunately, I think that there's often an immediate defensiveness that comes for white folks. You know, when there's racial progress, or even times that I'm thinking of are moments when harms or things are named, and white folks are just insistent on how they're, you know, they don't mean things, or, you know, they don't, oh, I didn't mean to be offensive, or, you know, questioning what harm has taken place, or questioning, you know, that you know, like needing proof that harm has happened or something like that. So I feel like there's just going back to the insistence on the white perspective, essentially. I think that there's often, that we often kind of go back to that perspective, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's good. Thanks, Rebekah. As I was thinking about that, I want to talk about the exceptionalism that is like really baked into Circle of Hope's church culture. Because when we talk about racial superiority, I think as a church, we've had a whole, like, this ethos of like, we're something different. We're doing something new. We're doing something unique. We've figured something out that other churches have gotten wrong, and that we haven't examined historically the ways that centering whiteness has been like very tied up in that exceptionalism. And so I think that has made it hard, like made us reluctant to like be able to receive negative feedback, right? Because if we're, you know, if we've got it right and other people have gotten it wrong, then when somebody comes to us and says like, oh, this like excludes people, or this is hurtful, or whatever, I think it's been too easy to dismiss that as like, well, they just don't get it. They're not part of the church culture. They don't understand that we're doing something different here with like this, like unexamined, how white supremacy is like all wound up in that. I was thinking of an article that was written by a former member about, I think, what was it called? Why I Quit White Church? Is that
Calinthia's article?
Yeah, Calinthia Dowdy's article. And you know, she talked about a theme of like, anytime it was brought up that this excludes, this is not like good for diversity, and we say that's our value, like the theme would keep coming back, like, oh well, we like our whatever it is the way it is. And so like that was actually centering the preferences of white folks to the exclusion of others, but like kind of under this umbrella of exceptionalism and racial superiority. So like kept us from fighting for change.
One of the things that I remember about how Circle of Hope approached race that I thought was interesting was kind of the resistance to identify whiteness in our church and in individuals. I remember white people saying, I'm so-called white. Like they were ready just to jump directly to post-racial consciousness without really interrogating their own whiteness. And, you know, without doing the work, having the right answer doesn't really make any sense. You know, you can't just jump to that without that. And I think that there was some superiority. It's interesting that you know that we have a culture of being superior and relating that to kind of white superiority. So Andre says that he's broken up with white Jesus. Have y'all done that too? You're both white people. How do you see Jesus differently? How does your journey through anti-racism, because I know, I mean, we're never done. And I just want to acknowledge that you're both white. You both said that. Your perspective is helpful to us because of the work you've done as white people in reading a book about losing white friends. So how have you broken up with white Jesus, or have you?
For sure. I think this was making me think back to those missionette days, for example. What I learned growing up, I would constantly pray like the sinner's prayer, and my belief in Jesus at that time was just based in purity culture and altar calls and just being saved in the afterlife, and just things like that. And now I definitely know Jesus as a brown man, as a liberator of the oppressed. And my relationship with sin now is like grappling with my sin of racism here and now is like a transformative process. And it has a lot more meaning than just trying to stay on top of like my sin forgiveness requests, which I feel like that's what like growing up was just like, all right, I just got to make sure I get in my sinner's prayer for today. So in case I die and go to heaven today,
Totally.
I die today. I used to honestly pray, dear Lord, ditto for the prayer that I said yesterday. I was too lazy to say, please forgive me my sins, just in case I died. So yeah. Anyway,
that experience is very common, Rebekah, among people that I've spoken to, where like,
yeah,
you need that daily assurance because there's so much fear of, and the dispensationalists like make up like it's like a horror movie that you're about to like live in. It's like completely terrifying.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think I'm a lot less afraid now, and I feel like it's a lot more just liberating and life-giving. And well, there's fear now, of course, but it's not fear of death. It's fear. It's like I want to be. It's fear because I'm struggling with my siblings, who are struggling. I'm struggling with the oppression that my siblings are facing. So that's where the fear is now.
What do you think, Corinne?
Yeah, it's interesting hearing your experience. I did not grow up evangelical. I grew up in like white liberal Christianity, like Presbyterian. But definitely like white Jesus is there too. There was still a focus on more of a focus on personal morality for sure. Like you're talking about like Jesus as like an individual relationship that brings like salvation, like more focus on like, I think in that context, right? Like love is polite, it's nice, it doesn't make waves, like we care about justice, but like also like see ourselves as maybe like good people and have a harder time interrogating ways that we participate in it. But then I spent time in like the same like evangelical church culture in seminary, and so I have some of that too. But I think that I've been deconstructing a lot of that for years, really, and that it's an ongoing process, right? Like I'm still definitely learning to read the Bible from the margins in ways like not assuming that the way that I've heard something preached or taught before, like interrogating ways that white patriarchy, all those things, right? Homophobia are like baked into the ways that I've heard scripture, and trying to like interrogate those things in myself. Again, we're not talking specifically about homophobia today. We're talking more about racism, but I think like it's all like one big messy knot of it's all tied together. So I was talking to a good friend of mine recently who's a gay man, and talking about like just deconstructing even the homophobia that like shows up in how we've read scriptures, and just saying to him, like, I'm sorting out a lot with Jesus these days. But like, if I know anything about Jesus, I know that he's for you. Like I would say in the same way to BIPOC siblings, like if there is a version of Jesus that's being taught that dehumanizes you, like that dehumanizes your personhood and like the oppressed and puts an undue burden on them, like that's not Jesus. And so, yeah, I think that like it's an ongoing process, because it's just something we need to keep unlearning because it keeps showing up.
Andre eventually, I mean, I hear what you're saying, Corinne. Andre eventually says he gets close to the edge of his faith and he almost loses it. He doesn't totally succumb to materialism, but he gets really close. So like, I agree with you that if the version of Jesus that you know isn't liberating, doesn't make you more like who you are, doesn't dignify you, then you should reject it. But like, so much of Christianity is like that. So despite that oppression, how do you hold on to your faith?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think my view of sin it is helpful in seeing sin as something that like that dehumanizes us, like a deep force of evil, right? Like, so white supremacy. I mean, I don't talk lightly about like demonic powers or something, but like a real force of evil in the world. And yeah, like discipleship to the way of Jesus leads me to reject that kind of sin, like, and that and seeing as a white person that it dehumanizes me too, that to follow Jesus, I need to be free of like those dehumanizing forces in me and in the world, and that like following Jesus is liberating for all of us. So like images of the God of Exodus that liberates, that Andre talks about. Yeah, I don't know that fully answers the question, but those are like frameworks that I lead into that I think are part of our faith, that are part of the Christian tradition. When we look at like the gifts that our tradition gives us for confession and repentance without self-condemnation, that allows us to like be honest about when we've gotten it wrong. Like, I think those are all really important tools that we can lean into in our faith to in the work of anti-racism. And like, I think I'm still working it out, you know, day to day, like that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love that answer, Corinne. I'm totally with it. And I feel like our faith guides like my inner work, and yeah, and also just brings the community around us to help us in this work too. And yeah, so I totally agree with what you're saying.
Andre writes this: rank and file white people also try to stamp out Black rage wherever it emerges. What do we understand about Black rage? How do we miss this? What have we experienced, even in Circle of Hope, that kind of evidences this point?
He uses an analogy that I thought was really great of Black rage like an alarm that lets us know that something's really wrong, and learning to see it as a gift that we can trust it. I was thinking like thinking of it as like, for me as a white person, Black rage as like a carbon monoxide detector, right? That like I don't on my own have the ability to sense something that a Black person who has experienced that oppression their whole life can right away detect and say, like, this is toxic. And so I think that was a really great image. I'm thinking of it for myself as like a carbon monoxide detector of like, maybe this wasn't visible to me, but it's telling me that like the air is poisonous, and like, and continuing like that view, like this is poisonous for all of us. So seeing it as a gift and something to warn us that we need to make a change, that there's something in the air that's killing us that we need to get away from.
Yeah. And I would add too, I think part of the reason we don't understand it sometimes is, one is because it indicates things in us that we actually have personally done.
Mm-hmm.
That's always so hard to see. Like, oh, I personally have done something to offend. That's always incredibly hard to like face, like, and actually, and, you know, repent of, not just to God and Jesus, but to your fellow person, and like, you know, actually get forgiveness or request forgiveness of. And also, I feel like we also, like white folks, like you're saying, we don't sense it, we don't feel it, and we don't continue to feel it. We don't, so we might get it intellectually, and we might get it intellectually for a minute. Like it's like, okay, thank you. You know, we get the information, we understand you're mad right now, but then like, do we check in later? Do we like continue to like ask, how are you doing? How is that thing going? How, like, if it happened outside of our community, you know, are we continuing to stay with it and making sure the person is okay, making sure the situation's okay? If it's happening inside our community, are we addressing it and, you know, staying with the problem and, and tending to it to make sure that, you know, that we are, that things are okay, like as if we are actually feeling it. Like,
right.
Yeah, I think that those are some of the issues, is that, that we're not trusting it so much to the point that we're feeling it in our bodies. So those are some of the things I would add.
Andre punctuates his book by the murders of Black men by police. And last week we were talking to Dante Stewart, who does the same thing. I remember, and I think you can mark in our church similar moments, right? After George Floyd, there was a lot of movement. And after Walter Wallace, which happened in Philadelphia, right? Got killed by police. We didn't know what to do with the rage. You know, at some point, Circle Thrift's window got broken. And we didn't know what to do with that, as far as I remember. You know, and there was a lot of anxiety around how white people would respond. Like universal, almost, it felt like. We're not thinking about people of color, we're thinking about white people. And the conversation became less about people's dignity and more about like philosophy. So like what about the people who aren't woke would have been like a question. So this is about wokeness as opposed to oppression of actual people. And I think we misplaced that a lot. Andre talks about not needing to convince white people. He says, why should these representatives of persecuted minority groups have to sit down and convince someone else that their lived experience is valid? Do you have an answer to that? We prize dialogue, but why isn't that what Andre is speaking about here? Why isn't it dialogue?
I mean, I think any person in an oppressed group should never have to justify the hurt or harm that they have experienced. I mean, they need to be trusted and heard. You know, when they have disclosed, first of all, if you've even created a safe enough environment for them to disclose a hurt or harm that they've experienced, like Corinne said earlier, treat that as a gift that you have received, that information, and then try and address, tend to that person and tend to the environment. And if it's happened in your environment, try and fix that environment. But also just, do what you can to create comfort for that person. It is not, we don't ask for, that's not dialogue. That is asking someone who's been harmed to justify the hurt that they've experienced. We don't ask that of white people. We don't, that's a victim of abuse. You're asking them to tell you how they've been abused. That's re-traumatizing. That's not dialogue. This is horrible. Yeah. Sorry, Corinne, I was going off. Go ahead.
No, that's great. I'm just thinking, I think I'm aware in myself that this is something that I keep having to check myself on. I'm aware that I want to believe that everybody can be oh, you'll see it. And in reality, that's not true. So I completely agree, Rebekah, that it's just not right or fair to ask the person who is experiencing this harm in their body, and against their personhood, right? To have to convince somebody of it's abusive to ask that of someone. And I think that for me, it's helpful to lean into places where I've been on the underside of that and remember how that feels, or lean into relationships of people that I love who've been on the underside of that and remember how that feels. Because kind of as we were saying, as white people, you don't feel it in your body in the same way. So for me, part of growing out of that, whatever, white socialization to want to think that way is remembering when I've been on the underside of a similar situation. I'm thinking of a time when I had a friend who was dating, I was working as an associate pastor at a church in California, and I had a friend who was dating this guy who was ultra conservative and thought women shouldn't be in ministry, and she convinced me to go out to lunch with him to talk him out of that viewpoint or something. And that was ridiculous. And so he was so disrespectful and talked down to me and all those things. I was what am I doing? Why did I agree to this? This is so gross. Right. And so leaning into me of an experience that oh yeah, that's how that feels. Helps me to be it's not reasonable to expect that that's dialogue we want to put people through.
And I think as white people, I would ask that you remember that too. It costs us a lot to have conversations that convince people of our dignity, but being an ally means kind of making yourself one with that vulnerability. And knowing that sometimes someone can't be convinced. Andre talks a lot about experiences that he's had with even in this chapter about white liberals, it's interesting because our white liberals, so to speak, don't even sound like that. They sound better. But we've seen complicity in racism among so-called white anti-racists. Our church was founded as an anti-racist church, but the results we bore were so different. It didn't matter what we said because the fruit of our labor didn't match our what we said, what we stood for, And even when this is pointed out to people, it was always their fault for pointing it out. Where else have we seen complicity in racism among white folks? And white folks that claim they're anti-racist. I ain't talking about white supremacists or white nationalists or Christian nationalists, which we don't have a lot of. as far as I know. But we still deal with racism. Can you think of anything?
Yeah, I think there's lots of examples that we could name. Centering white comfort, like we've already talked about, for sure, like asking questions like, well, how will the people who aren't woke feel about this, rather than centering the experience of people who are being harmed. Thinking about times, Jonny, when like your blog was discussed as like too political, right? Like, how are people going to react to something that you wrote? Thinking about that there was resistance when we formed the New Humanity team, right? Like you had written, Jonny, like the article on Matthew 18 and how that can be used to abuse power in interracial and racialized conflict. And, we wanted to make institutional change and create this New Humanity team that could get in there and like be an intermediary. So you don't ask the oppressed person to like go up against the person in power. And that there was like resistance to that, or like, do we really need that? Thinking about times when the ideas of affinity groups were shot down because like, oh, that's what cells are. You're just being divisive if you, yeah. Are you going to say something? Like as I sat down, I was like, oh, there's so many, there's so many things I can point to of ways that showed up.
And the things that I was thinking about too is just like going along. I mean, I've had a long tenure with Circle of Hope, and just thinking about like stories that I personally have gone along with, and even times when I've, I remember, asking questions a long time ago, saying like, well, what happened, with these relationships when, Black pastors have left, for example, and things like that. And just, I asked the question to the white pastors who are here still. I didn't ask the folks who had left. And I took those stories. I let the stories exist, as they were, as they stood. So that was my complicity right there. So, I think about that kind of thing. So that's, like you said, it's not necessarily like a white nationalist sort of situation, but that is complicity right there. So, I could have done something different. Possibly.
Totally.
Yeah.
I didn't think about what you were saying. Like, Corinne, you said something about like people thinking my blog was too political. And I hadn't even considered that personally. And even as Andre tells the story about his experience at Relevant, like I read that story and I was like, oh, this sounds familiar, because Andre is at Relevant. He's an editor there, and he decides to write an article, a whole series on Black History Month. And then his editor gets all up in his face and tells him not to. We have to counteract this. We have to talk about other things. And then he loses some editorial power that he has. And Relevant is one of those places that's supposed to be kind of like progressive evangelical-ish type of place. It has a lot of similarities to Circle of Hope. And I remember hearing, you should write about something else. Don't always write about this, over and over and over again, and it was painful, but I hadn't considered how Andre's experience mirrored mine. How else have we seen those similar patterns where like centering the voices of marginalized in our writing, in what we put out in our content, is resisted or was resisted?
This story from his story from Relevant magazine, like that whole chapter was like, I thought the most impactful in like looking at Circle of Hope. Like as I was reading it, I was like, oh my God, like the same thing happened here, right? Like, do you remember when the Circle Mobilizing Because Black Lives Matter team wanted to take do a daily Black History Month post on the daily prayer blog, like literally the same thing happened. And like told like, no, that's already like those slots are already taken. And we had to be like, oh, okay. We'll just put it up on our own blog, which gets less traffic than like so I assume gets less traffic than the daily prayer blog, which is like just more widely publicized to the whole church. Which is a whole nother thing. But yeah, like that exact thing actually happened over Black History Month daily posts. So certainly there's that, but there's lots of other examples too. Yeah, maybe you have some that came to mind, Rebekah.
No, it was just too spot on that it was almost the exact same story that happened with us.
Uh-huh.
At the exact same time. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So the same exact thing happened, literally. Like they wanted to write these posts and then it was blocked,
Yeah.
That really did start our journey on anti-racism and Circle of Hope,
Mm-hmm.
I remember I met with Bethany and then that January. It was January it wasn't January. It was January 2020 because it wasn't even like close to Black History Month yet.
And that was pre-pandemic. Yeah. Shout out to Bethany Stewart, leader of Circle Mobilizing for Black Lives Matter.
And our anti-racist consultant.
Yes.
Yeah, she's been at the forefront of leading us in this for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Andre calls for unity, but not all kinds of unity. What does he warn against, and what kind of unity does he advocate for? And can you make that distinction? Do you guys remember?
Yeah, what I was remembering was he was talking about this unity in suffering, I believe.
Sure.
And kind of, well, this is how I was taking it. It was like this unity in suffering more so than like kind of a unity that was more superficial and kind of like, oh yeah, we're unified, but like just forget about like the things that happen. We're just let's all get along and bypass anything bad that happened. Instead, if we're unified in suffering, we actually see each other, and oppressors, white folks can actually take on the complexity of our position and understand understand ourselves and have awareness and deal with what we need to deal with, and build unity with the oppressed, actually feel what it feels like, and fight together. So that's how I was sort of taking it. What do you think, Corinne?
Yeah, I agree. He quotes Martin Luther King, and when he says, like this idea of unity for struggle. He says, he's quoting Dr. King and says, with this faith, we will be able to work together, to pray together, to struggle together, to go to jail together, to stand up for freedom together, knowing we will be free one day. Then he says, white people are out here quoting the together part and leaving out the part about struggling and going to jail. And I think that like white evangelicalism absolutely wants to like skip all that, right? And just get to this like post-racial society where these things are already solved, and not engage in the struggle or take responsibility for it.
Totally.
Yeah. I was thinking about how as a church, we have been able to, on the topic of pacifism, like I feel like we know how to stand for something and not just be like, oh, it's okay that we disagree. And we all like, I think that it's not that common within wider Christianity to take like a hard stance for pacifism, but traditionally our church has seen pacifism as essential to the way of Jesus, and like able to say like, this is what we're for. And we don't believe that the way of Jesus is violence or war. Right. And I've always wondered, like, we don't talk about unity there. We're not like, well, we can all just like be in different places and agree to, maybe you can articulate it better, but like, we've been willing to say, like, we have a position on that, which is something controversial within wider Christianity. And maybe that can, either inform us or like help us to know, I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but just that, like, why haven't we been able to do the same thing always on white supremacy? Like when it comes to white supremacy, we're like, oh, like, let's not be too controversial or make people uncomfortable. I don't know. Maybe I want to say more, but I was just kind of making that comparison of.
I think about this topic a lot because of the book I wrote about Jesus taking a side, and a lot of people talk about divisiveness and how political conversations can be divisive, and how anti-racism is divisive, how people of color kind of conglomerating on their own in groups is divisive. I mean, Andre says it was illegal for Black people to do that in the US for a long time. And for all intents and purposes, it was illegal in Circle of Hope too. So harmony and unity is good when we have the same goals. And even diversity of opinion is good when we have the same goals. It becomes a lot different when our goals are different. And unity when we have different goals doesn't seem to make sense, and that unity falls in the back of oppressed people. How do we make our church that's predominantly white, one that's built by the oppressed, building their own table is what Andre says. White people need to learn how to share power. Yes. But he's talking about Black people specifically, also need to empower ourselves. How do we do that practically? As I was reflecting on Andre's book and also Dante's last week, both of them find their unity, their sense of fulfillment in spaces that are not white, that are predominantly made of people like them. They empower themselves. What are we charged with as Circle of Hope to help this table be made by white people? Not by white people. It is made by white people, by people of color, by the oppressed.
If I can read a little bit more of what he wrote, he gives some like really practical.
Yeah, go ahead.
So he says an organization can't be defensive about racism if it wants to be anti-racist, even if it's working on the problem. Organizations that want to be anti-racist will make assuring Black people of their efforts a priority. When their behavior invites critique, they say, yes, anti-Blackness has been a problem here. We're sorry. We're working on it. Here's how. Says that anti-racist institutions don't conflate the presence of anti-racists within their organization with being an anti-racist organization, right? So for us, having a Circle Mobilizing Because Black Lives Matter team that is kept out of institutional decisions and the work of it considered opt-in is like not the same as having an organizational wide, this is his words again, anti-racist ethos and practice. Until an institution is actively investigating and confronting white supremacy within the organization, it is a racist institution. Real anti-racism is tangible, and it includes things like I liked this list, right? So buy-in from senior leadership, efforts to educate staff and leaders, accountability for racist behavior, explicit inclusion of anti-racism in the core values of the institution, incorporation of Black people and people of color in positions of real institutional power. So
it's a good list.
Yeah. I think finding tangible ways, and I think we are working on some of them for sure, but tangible ways to make all those things real and core to the church that we want to be, that we're building together. It's like a pretty good place to start.
Any thoughts, Rebekah?
Yeah, I love that, just kind of going straight to Andre's instructions there. Also, I was just thinking about like how he talked about like focusing on racial equity, not racial diversity, and kind of like that distinction there. This is definitely like a big conundrum for a predominantly white church, and I feel like we've been pondering how to do this without causing excess labor to the marginalized. Like, my first instinct is, let's ask marginalized folks to be in decision-making positions or something. But that's a lot of pressure. It's very demanding. That's like, it can be, and that's not everybody's cup of tea. That's not, what everybody necessarily wants to do. I think it goes back to what we were saying earlier, that it's, I just want to say it also means that white people are then still off the hook. Like, it just means, no, you can go ahead and make all the decisions, and white people still don't have to like do anything or struggle with you. Right. Like, so the point is, the white people have to get on board and struggle together, right? Like, we have to actually feel this and do this together, and listen and be humble, and I feel like it's really about creating this culture of struggling together, listening to the experiences, the specific experiences of the oppression that people have felt in our community here and in general in society, and facing it, naming it, exactly like you were saying, Corinne, and moving together, at the direction and in the interest of the marginalized, not necessarily that they have to, that the oppressed people have to do all of the work at the helm, but that their interests are most served. And, white people can do a lot of that work, because that's a lot of us here need to be doing a lot of that work to move us forward. So that's what I keep thinking about, how we do this practically.
Excellent.
Yeah.
How do we honor people who have left the community now? Like, people have left and maybe even pursued communities of color, communities that look a little bit different. And for a long time, we would just like ice them out, not listen to them. Rebekah, you were speaking to that. How do we honor those who have left? Because we were white friends they couldn't keep.
I'm thinking we keep working towards liberation together. I'm not sure if we can. My instinct is that I would love to reconcile or rejoin with folks, but of course there's been harm, there's been difficulties experienced, and I honor, the difficulties that have happened. And if I was a person who had moved on, I at least would take some solace if the community changed. that would be just nice to know, maybe, even if I had moved on.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, just it might just be good, or I'm just thinking that, like, as a community, like, let's keep building this honesty and accountability and moving forward together. So, it would be amazing to reconcile with folks, and also just that we can preserve our own relationships and here, but build the trust and for, with each other, and also, for folks that we do want to meet. So
where do you think our biggest growth edge is as we come to the end of this conversation? Where can we grow? What do you see next for us as a community? I would say I would like us to, yes, be led by people of color, queer people, disabled people, and be a place where they're nourished and they can flourish and not just burn out. We did a lot of good racial, anti-racist work in the last couple of years, but the cost was high. It was painful. It was difficult, and the payoff doesn't really match it,
Mm-hmm.
So I'd like us to figure out how to do that. Any other ideas?
Yeah, it's such a big question, but that would be the goal, right?
Mm-hmm.
Telling a more honest story about ourselves, learning humility, being able to just honor each other and in deeper ways that value people deeply, that people don't get kind of sacrificed for the mission or something.
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
That's such a big question. I'm like,
yeah, I think I was really impacted when he was talking about the chapter about hope, and how he talks about hope being a regimen and not necessarily a feeling. And I had a quote written here when he was talking about the best freedom fighters understand that people need something to believe in. Yelling, "Where is your outrage?" doesn't work nearly as well as presenting a frustrated, persecuted people a compelling vision of what the world could be like if they'll organize themselves for sustained resistance. So I just think about like how are we sustaining ourselves? Like you were saying, Jonny, like he talks a lot about joy and things like that too, where it's like this can't just be all about the harm and the pain, and
right.
Yeah, we have to face these things and tell these stories so that we can rebuild the trust and the honesty and accountability, and find like a real honest place with each other.
Totally.
Yeah, I think that's what I'm looking for, I think.
Excellent.
Yeah, I'm thinking like developing deep. It's already, I don't want to say we haven't done this, but like deep theology, but also discipleship in that theology of like how following Jesus in anti-racism is freeing, right? That like we can all see ourselves in that story and in a way that brings flourishing to the whole community, and like helping people to ground ourselves in a theology that sees sin and sees liberation in that way, that'll shape us, that'll help us be humble, that'll help us to get free of oppressive theologies that aren't the way of Jesus, right? Like really grounding our theology and our ideas about sin and community for all of us in that. And I think there's hope and joy and freedom for us in that. And I think we can all be part of that.
I totally agree. Thanks y'all for this conversation. Once again, Corinne is one of the leaders in Circle of Hope, and so is Rebekah. I love working alongside of you. I'm honored to have this talk. Thanks for making it happen.
Yeah, thank you, Jonny. This is awesome.
So good. Thanks, Jonny. Thanks, Rebekah.
We end our episode by holding on to the good and elevating what is nourishing to our souls, hoping that it can also nourish you. even just the practice of reflecting on what has nourished my soul over the last 2 weeks is a good practice. So we offer this to you, pastors. What is nourishing to your soul?
Well, I got a tattoo this week, another tattoo. I don't have that many, so it is a big deal for me. But my sister and I went and got tattoos to remind us of the Velveteen Rabbit book. We both really love that book because the stuffed rabbit becomes real by kind of falling apart, but being loved. It becomes real by being loved. And let me just read you a quote from the book. He said, "You become. It takes a long time. That's why it doesn't happen often to people who break easily or have sharp edges or have to be carefully kept. Generally, by the time you are real, most of your hair has been loved off and your eyes drop out and you get loose in the joints and very shabby, but these things don't matter at all." And we wanted to remember that. And so my sister, who's not afraid, she told me she had a tattoo guy, and here it was in Atlantic City. She's not afraid of many things. It was in Atlantic City, like with all these biker dudes, who have a lot of tattoos. And so it was just funny, like we're these two little white blonde women, and I was laying there on the table thinking, where have you brought me, Rebekah? And all of a sudden the garage, the back of the shop must have been this garage door, because all of a sudden, like, all this light, it lifted up loudly and all this light poured in and all these people came in, and it was like a party in there all of a sudden as I'm getting this painful tattoo on the inside of my bicep. So it was a fun experience with my sister, and I'm just grateful that we keep transforming together and remembering, like, it's through vulnerability that we grow. And we even got it on the inside of our bicep to remember that, like, when we're weak, then we are strong.
I spent a lot of times around lakes this summer. So in the Poconos, I have some friends that have places there. And I like the cool breeze up there. I like the mountains. I like the trees. It has its own feel that I appreciate. And the kids play in the lake, and they often put sand on the edge of the lake. It's usually a dammed, like, creek or river that creates the lake. And then there's sand at the end of it. So it's like simulating the beach, but it's not the beach. And I recently encountered that because I went to the beach a couple times this summer. And when you go into the water, first of all, on the shore itself, the waves are loud. So you can hear them over the conversation you're having with your friends. And then it's almost always there's a breeze at the beach. And so it's filling your ears too. And when you're on the shore and you're watching the beach or you're reading your book or whatever you're doing, there's a sense of being alone because what is around you is so much more magnificent and powerful than you are. And there's a sense of solitude there. And I would also say, like, a sense of privacy because you can't hear anybody around you. On the lake, everybody's hearing one another. You're yelling across the water. You can hear, you can listen. But in the beach and on the ocean, it kind of consumes you. And then when you go into the water, there's power in the tide and in the current and in the waves. It's really unbelievable. I've been going to the beach for my whole life, but I've noticed it this year in a unique way. And there's a peace in knowing how small you are that I only experience at the beach, right? Even in Atlantic City, you're on the boardwalk and there's music and there's DJs and the casinos are there, but you can still hear the waves. They're still supreme. And in that power and in that magnitude and in the smallness that I feel, my problems are made smaller, my struggles are made smaller. And so I have a sense of peace. When you're in the water and you're being taken by a wave, your own tininess, for me, brings a sense of peace to myself, that there's something much more powerful than me around me, and something so much more consistent, something so much more bigger than I am happening, that I can rely on. The waves are there, the chorus is there, the singing of the waves is there, and that comforts me, and that comforted my soul this week.
That's beautiful, Jonny. That really resonates with me too.
Makes me want to go to the beach. I can feel some of that just in your description, Jonny. Thanks.
Not too late. It's not too late.
It's true.
The beach, September might be the best beach month.
Yeah, I could agree with that. So what's nourishing my soul has to do with the sounds around me. Steve and I are not big gift givers, but for our anniversary this summer, he had the idea to buy wind chimes that we have heard and listened to for the past several years at his aunt and uncle's cabin where we've gone on vacation. They're the beautiful wind chimes that are literally tuned to harmonize. And his uncle was a music professor. So we're like, of course, Uncle John would have tuned music wind chimes. So he looked up the information and bought us some for our anniversary. And it is nourishing my soul. Even just the little bit of breeze that goes down our back alley is enough to, make the music, and the sound just kind of wafts through our house on the warm summer afternoons, in the evening, and the music mixes with the sounds of the city and the neighborhood and the basketballs that are going on the court across the street all the time. So the music of these chimes is nourishing my soul. We got the, what was it? We got the Nashville. You can listen to different options online. This is how serious this is. They tune different tones, different scales. And so whatever is resonates for you,
Can you send us the link so we can listen?
I will. Yes. So we bought the Nashville alto set, and that's the music that I'm listening to throughout the day. That's nourishing to me.
Just so beautiful that the wind makes the sound.
Yep. It's surprising every time, because there's no predicting when it will come, when it will end. There's no control over it. It's just this gift. It's a reminder both that the wind, the breeze itself is a gift, but then also that the music is a gift. It reminds me of that old hymn, How Can I Keep From Singing?
Oh.
When the lyrics, right? It's such a beautiful hymn. And one of the verses says, through all the tumult and the strife, I hear the music ringing. It sounds an echo in my soul. How can I keep from singing? So the chimes, the music of these chimes reminds me to join in from the depths of my soul.
Amen.
Thanks for listening to our podcast. We hope that you're finding things that nourish your soul this week. Write to us and share them. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time.
How long have you had that fish sauce in there, Rachel?
I almost 20 years. All 3 houses that I've lived in Philly.
What?
Come with me.
The
Yeah.
same bottle?
The same bottle, because I only use a couple drops at a time.
Not
Yeah,
all fish
no,
sauce is.
That can't be okay.
Is that why it smells so bad, or does it?
Well,
or
I
does
don't
all
think-
fish
I-
sauce
no,
smell
no.
bad?
Not all fish sauce is created equally. Now, fish sauce is fermented anchovies that are pressed. Okay. And not all fish sauce is created equally. Like I think we should do a fish sauce taste test one day where we have like little cups of it. Now this is a pungent taste
Wow.
test, but I cycle through my fish sauce fast. Like, like there's certain things in your house, or like you're looking through a grocery list or ingredient list for a recipe, and you're like, oh yeah, I have that. I don't need to buy it, right? Because you know what you have. My inventory of fish sauce is unreliable because at any time it could be out because I use it with such frequency. So,
Wow. What do you make?
I add fish sauce to beef stew. I add fish sauce to like a chicken casserole. But it's not just like Asian food. You know?
Wow.
You are blowing Rachel's mind right now.
Although,
Yes.
right by you. You've been to Cafe Non, right, Rachel?
Yes.
It's like right on Snyder there.
Mm-hmm.
It's like on 16th and Dickinson.
Mm-hmm.
So it's right by your building. Her chicken wings are like fish sauce chicken wings, and they don't taste like fish sauce. They just taste like they're the most delicious thing you've ever had.
Wow. Yeah. I
So-
think I need to buy new fish sauce because mine's a little funkier than fish sauce. should
I
be.
like Red Boat. I like Red Boat, and my favorite Vietnamese cookbook author uses it, and she's Vietnamese, so that's what I recommend.
And you're wearing the t-shirt Red Boat, which is
I
what
can't see
started
him
this
wearing-
conversation.
Can you see?
Yeah.
See, on the
How did you-
back, it just, what does it say? Just add salt,
Yep.
Yeah.
and it has
Wow.
an anchovy on there. They sell the
wish-
shirts.
You probably
One
got
second.
a free one for making such good food from their recipes. Oh, Jonny. What a treat.